I'm Carrie Weber. I'm the Executive Director of the Fairfield University Art Museum, and we are so delighted to see you all here this evening to kick off our symposium. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this Arthur Szyk symposium, the keynote address, Art Propaganda Memory. I don't know if she's here, but I'd like to acknowledge State Representative Jennifer Leeper, if she is here with us this evening. She was hoping to make it. I want to thank a few people before we get started who have helped to make this evening and tomorrow's proceedings possible. Connecticut Humanities for their robust implementation grant, and our exhibition co-sponsors, Karen Savell and the Jewish Federation of Greater Fairfield County, Glenn Diner and the Bennett Center for Judaic Studies, Gav Rosenfeld and the Center for Jewish History in New York, all of them for supporting the Szyk exhibition and the associated programming in myriad ways. I especially want to highlight the Jewish Federation and their generous grant in support of this symposium. I want to highlight the Bennett Center's generosity in covering the costs of live streaming and recording the proceedings of the symposium, thereby making them accessible to Szyk aficionados worldwide, many of whom are watching tonight. A quick thank you to all of the other donors to the exhibition in the room with us this evening. You can find a list in the back of your program if you didn't get one there. You can get one at the end of the talk and bring it with you tomorrow if you're coming. We're so grateful for all of your support, which made the exhibition possible. A quick shout out to our media sponsors, some of whom are with us tonight, the Allgemeiner, the Westport Journal, and WSHU. Thank you for helping us to spread the word. I understand the word is being spread, which is great. Reminder, we have a full day of proceedings tomorrow with papers from the 8 prestigious scholars who have joined us to present at this symposium from across the country, starting at 10 a.m. in the Dogwood Room of the Barone Campus Center. We're giving you all a wonderful tour of the Fairfield University campus. I know some of you have never been in this beautiful Kelly presentation room before. Maybe you've never been to the Dogwood Room in the Barone Campus Center before. It is right there on the other side of this traffic circle in the campus center, the very glass modern building right over there. It is on the main level. And there's people at the desk when you walk in who can help you find it. We will be there all day, and we hope to see you. If you can't make it, it will be live streamed, just like this is being live streamed. You go to thequicklive.com, and you just watch. But it's also being recorded, so if you can't watch tomorrow, you can watch at another time. If you've not yet visited the exhibition, or you'd like to revisit it, we have exciting news. We will have docent-led tours starting next week. You can find the schedule on Eventbrite. We've just posted them, but you can also find them on our social media channels starting tomorrow and hopefully listed on the website, the exhibition website as well. And if you haven't checked out the Szyk the Interactive Experience yet in the Walsh Gallery, it's open until 7:30 tonight, so you could pop down there after this if you feel like it. I would now like to introduce you to the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences to say a few words, Dr. Richard Greenwald.
Thank you very much. I'll be brief, but I just have to say how exciting it is to have this room full of intellectuals and community partners, students, faculty, public officials somewhere. This is an example of what the power of art can do, bring us all together to examine important issues and to think deeply. So I am just so happy to see this event after a long time talking about it with various faculty members and administrators, see these things happen. So thank you very much for being here. My job tonight really is just to do one thing, and that is to introduce our Provost and Chief Academic Officer, Christine Siegel, who will do some words of welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Rich, and thank you all for being here. Here at Fairfield University, our motto in Latin translates to the English, through faith to the fullness of truth. As a university in the Jesuit Catholic tradition, all of our activity and energy is aimed at the pursuit of the truth, be it through our academic degree programs, our research productivity, or our community programming. While we proudly profess this, we also recognize that it is not always easy to look at the truth. At times, the truth about ourselves, our families, our communities, and our nations may be ones that we do not want to confront. The realities of humanity, in all its imperfection, are not always pretty. Thus, we need artists like Arthur Szyk, who are willing first to see themselves and second to depict for us the truth, even when it is ugly. At Fairfield University, in keeping with our mission to pursue the truth, we are proud to be one of only 3 locations in the country to host the extensive exhibit of Szyk's work entitled Arthur Szyk, Artist and Soldier for Human Rights. We are especially proud because for a period of time in his life, Szyk lived within our Fairfield County community, and thus we bring his work to the Fairfield area and the greater Northeast region. We recognize the monumental importance of Szyk's work, which continues to call our attention to the human rights abuses perpetrated by the Nazis during the Second World War, and also to the human rights abuses occurring in this country during the last century. Szyk points us to look at the difficult truths we profess to pursue. Complicating our pursuit, however, our Jesuit Catholic tradition further posits that even when it is shown to us, no one person, school of thought, or academic discipline is capable of fully comprehending it. Thus, we need opportunities to come together across disciplines to not only exhibit, but also examine the hard realities that artists like Szyk depict, to consider these realities in their historical context, and further to contend with what they mean for us today. Thus, at Fairfield University, we are really proud that accompanying the Szyk exhibit on our campus this semester, we have a range of programs that engage students, professors, and members of our larger community in a dialogue about Szyk's work, so that together we may come to a fuller understanding of what his depictions say about the true range of humanity. On behalf of President Nemec and the Fairfield University administration, I welcome you all to the dialogue this evening, which begins with a keynote, and to those who are joining us tomorrow to continue the dialogue at the Symposium of Scholars. I would like to acknowledge all of those who help us carry out our mission by making tonight's event possible. First, to Irvin Unger, who's been called the man behind the Szyk Renaissance, for his curation of the exhibit. To Ellen Umansky, who brought Unger and his collection to the attention of her colleague Philip Eliasov and facilitated the relationship that led to the opportunity for the Fairfield University Art Museum to host the Szyk exhibit. To Philip for directing his deep knowledge, boundless energy, and passion toward bringing the exhibit to campus, and moreover, for ensuring that it was accompanied by a full range of programming. To all of our symposium speakers who contributed essays to our catalog and who are bringing their work to us tomorrow to help us extend the dialogue in pursuit of our mission. And to Carrie Weber and the staff in the Fairfield University Art Museum who worked with Ellen, Philip, our symposium speakers, countless colleagues across campus to bring the vision of the exhibit and programming to reality. And most importantly, echoing Ellen, I'd like to thank the generous benefactors, many of whom she named, others who are listed tonight, donors, friends of the Fairfield University community, without whose financial support the exhibit and events would not be possible. All of you help us fulfill our mission through faith to the fullness of truth. Thank you.
It's now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Stephen Luckert. I want to say that we are especially grateful to have him here since it was a little touch and go last week when it looked like the government was going to shut down. If that had happened, he would not have been here. He would have had to stay in DC. But he is here. We are thrilled. Stephen Luckert is the Senior Program Curator in the Levine Institute for Holocaust Education at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. He served for 20 years as the curator of the museum's acclaimed permanent exhibition, The Holocaust. In addition, he curated 8 special exhibitions, including The Art and Politics of Arthur Szyk and State of Deception, The Power of Nazi Propaganda. He has appeared in many media outlets, including C-SPAN, CNN, the Associated Press, Reuters International, History Detectives, the History Channel, the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, National Geographic Channel, and the Atlantic. Stephen Luckert received his PhD in modern European history from the State University of New York at Binghamton and has published on German history, the Holocaust, Arthur Szyk, and Nazi propaganda. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Luckert.
Carrie, thank you very much for that warm introduction. And I want to thank Fairfield University for inviting me. I was deeply honored, when they asked me to participate in that, and even more honored and impressed that they said, we want you to do the keynote address. I said, me, but because in some ways I said to myself, it's kind of become a homecoming in some ways for me, in a sense, with Arthur Szyk. Because many years ago when I helped co-curated the Art and Politics of Arthur Szyk at the museum, it was almost maybe over 20 years ago. And, I finished that, and, I said, I pretty much, maybe I'm done with Szyk. And Irvin Unger kept saying, you got to do some more stuff with Szyk, but, I moved on to other things, and, but still there was something, there's a lot to say about Szyk, And then one of my colleagues at the museum said, we're doing a program on art and activism. Do you want to talk about Szyk? And I said, yeah, I'll do that. We did a Facebook Live. And then that triggered, Rachel Stern in New York at the Fritz Ascher Society to say, can you do another thing on Szyk? And then Ori Soltis, he said, let's do something on Szyk, let's write, another piece on it. So it was like I was being reeled back into the world of Arthur Szyk. And, and it was a very pleasant experience. It was like, catching up with an old friend and to learn more about it. And, one of the things that I'm always impressed with Szyk, I've always been impressed with Szyk's kind of artistic activism. That here was an artist who actually did a variety of things. Who was known in some circles for his Jewish art. Then there were many that knew him from his World War II cartoons. And then there was a whole nother audience that knew him from his book illustrations that he did, even on non-Jewish themes, the Arabian Nights, Andersen's fairy tales, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, and other things. So Szyk had this, had influence in various ways. But Szyk, I think one of the remarkable things about Szyk is that he saw that art was a weapon, that art could be a weapon to change society in a just way. That whether that's calling attention to the persecution of the Jews, whether that's calling for support for the Allied cause during the Second World War when the United States was neutral, or calling attention to what was happening to African Americans, to blacks in the United States. And in some ways, this was something unique, that Szyk combined all of these things, and he was working on many of these things. And if we could take a look at these are, I use these two illustrations of Szyk that kind of convey that activism. The first one, which you'll see in the exhibition here, shows Szyk in military garb, drawing a picture of Goering with a skeleton. And then the other is from an illustration from Ink and Blood, a publication that he put out. And it shows him again, this kind of cartoonist, artist, activist, kind of finishing the job, his dedication to, eliminating the Axis threat. And you can see, for instance, that he's got in the ash can of history, you've got Mussolini, you've got Pierre Laval, and Philippe Pétain, who have already by this time, been finished, so to speak, and Szyk is aiming to eliminate, Adolf Hitler and the remaining Nazis and their Japanese allies. So for me, this conveys a lot of Szyk's, the notion of using art as a weapon. And Szyk was someone who personally identified himself as a propagandist. Now today we kind of think, oh, that's anathema. No one should, would call themselves a propagandist. But what Szyk meant by that was that his art had a message. And that's true if you look, and he believed that much of Western culture, that the art of the ancient Greeks, of the ancient Romans, was in the service of propaganda. That is, it was all carried a message to promote a particular cause. And so Szyk saw himself very much in that role, that his art was to serve a particular cause. And you can even look at, for instance, his Haggadah, which is rightly acclaimed. That is, and on one hand, it can be read as a text that's used to celebrate Passover on a yearly basis. But Szyk's takes on a very different tone. And it goes beyond that to serve as a kind of critique of what's going on in the world of the 1930s. Now, when I was thinking about the topic, Szyk's anti-Nazi caricatures, one of the things that I struggled with was that the different layers that one has in Szyk's interpretations. So you've got kind of the standard, depictions of the Nazis. What David Lowe, the British cartoonist, called the Fat Fritz, the overweight German. You've got the kind of monocle wearing, arrogant, Junker and Wehrmacht officer. So those are kind of the standard, what we see as kind of the standard archetypes, if one will, that were commonly used in cartoons. I think Szyk often has a great deal more detail in these, and I think aims at different things, but I think he adopts a lot of those standard types. Now, here we have another one that two images that use caricature, which caricatures are depictions, but often use exaggerations in those to highlight a particular feature. So that, for instance, you have these images of Goebbels being used, and they emphasize Joseph Goebbels, who was the Reich Minister for Public Enlightenment and Propaganda in Germany. Szyk uses this to get at, Goebbels as a liar, as somebody who promotes falsehood, who's, who stinks. He carries that, like that odor of lying. So it's this notion, of saying something about the. Oh, sorry. Okay, so that it conveys something about those particular Nazi leaders. These depictions of Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe, also point to the kind of his vanity, the ways in which he, wore all these elaborate uniforms and gave himself medals, but also the notion of his looting. And you see these bags that he's carrying there, and that are monogrammed, but it refers to his looting of artwork, which Jonathan has detailed very much in his own research. But Szyk used this to kind of lampoon and criticize these Nazi leaders. And I want to just bring up that Szyk, of course, as a cartoonist, had been active long before the Second World War, even at the time of the First World War. Szyk was using his pen as a cartoonist to attack German militarism. After the war, Szyk raised the threat of German militarism in the post-war era. And even when the Nazis came to power, one finds several cartoons that Szyk did. And Szyk would often say, well, we know there's a war going on of Szyk's cartooning. That is, when he goes to resorts to that he in fact is involved in fighting a war. Szyk, of course, was someone who drew deeply on the Judeo-Christian iconography of the past. And one of the things that I find very interesting about Szyk is the kind of ways that you can dig deeper and deeper into his messaging. So that, for instance, and sometimes you start questioning and asking yourself, what is Szyk trying to get at? On this, I look at this one that's in the show here, which references the kind of crucifixion, the martyrdom of the Polish Catholic population by the Nazis. And this, of course, is a reference to the brutalities that the Nazis unleashed in Poland after the invasion against both the Jewish and the Polish populations. And so you even have this image that Szyk did of Heinrich Himmler with a list of Poles and Jews who were to be executed. Is something that he did to call attention to this. And this was something that Szyk saw as a way of, fighting against us, alerting people to the danger that Nazism represented. And often he resorted to using themes and symbols that were the kind of common symbols and vocabulary of this Western Judeo-Christian tradition. When I looked at this, the image of Hitler, I kept saying, well, who is Hitler's? Is there a link to, is he supposed to represent a biblical figure here? Is it this, there are references, throughout to those that mock Jesus on the cross. And is this what Szyk is getting at? Could this be representative of Roman soldiers, the Roman occupiers of that region? Is this a reference to, those that in Christian tradition were often identified as Jews mocking Jesus on the cross? And, it's one of the interesting things that I think we're going to talk about in this, the way Szyk takes and transforms negative images of Jews for a particular purpose, or in the case of the other image that we have there showing Jesus. And you see that Jesus has got the marked on the shoulder with the Star of David, in German with the King of the Jews. That is the notion that Jesus, of reclaiming Jesus for the Jews, and we see this in De Profundis, which is also in the exhibition, the notion that Jesus was part of the Jewish people and would have been persecuted by the Nazis as a Jew. And so and we see this, in the art community. Of course, Chagall was another proponent of reclaiming Jesus for the Jewish people. And so we see Szyk doing this, and this is to raise an interesting point, which during Szyk's campaigns with the Bergson group, to, as part of this action and not pity, to call attention both to what was happening or what happened to the Jews, but also to call, in this particular case, to call attention to the lack of representation the Jews had after the war. And so you see Szyk's representing all these different groups that are entering in, for the first meeting of the United Nations. But the Jews aren't represented. And so he's calling attention to that that the Jews represented by Jesus here have suffered but are not represented in this new one, but in the United Nations. But I think for Szyk, the idea of using these symbols and themes from the Bible was extremely important to him, as a way of addressing particular problems in society, and using this common vocabulary. Now, this is something that Szyk said to a journalist when he came to Canada in 1940. Now, Szyk came to Canada in part as a kind of both a personal crusade on behalf of the British cause, the Allied cause during the war, but also as a Jewish artist. That is, Szyk appealed to both the Polish and the British governments to be allowed to come to the United States to use his art to galvanize support for the Allied cause, and also to win over American Jews to the cause. That is, Szyk believed that many American Jews had become antagonistic towards Britain over the White Paper, which restricted immigration to British-mandated Palestine. So for Szyk, he talked about, well, I'll go to Hollywood, I'll go meet with Eddie Cantor and with various others and try to win them over. I'll use my art to try to appeal to both the American Jewish population, but also to the broader American public, to try to win support for them, for the Allied cause. And of course, he told, when he got to Canada, he spoke to the journalists. He said, this is a war to the end of faith, of God, of everything. If Germany conquers, it is a fight between God and Satan. And again, we have this kind of linkage to this kind of fight between good and evil, this notion that the Nazis are the personification, the symbol that symbolizes the evil in the world. And the threat that it poses to the new world. That is, here's a piece that Szyk did in Ottawa, and it shows the idea was to convey the threat, and it points to, of course, in a humorous way, that Hitler is this failed painter attempting to paint all of Europe black under the death's head, and the only country that remains that can stop him is Great Britain. But by the way that Szyk has created this globe, of course, is to show the next things in line are Canada and the United States. That Hitler's threat is a global threat. That the threat of Nazism isn't just what happened in Europe. that threat is something that's going to, eventually involve the entire world. So he was calling attention to this and, of course, pointing out the need to aid the British effort to snap to stop Hitler. And this is another piece that's in the exhibition that kind of conveys that notion of the global threat that the Nazis represented. And of course, you have to realize that for Szyk, there's a very deeply personal part of this. Szyk, of course, was born in Łódź, Poland, but he had lived outside of Poland for much of his life. And when the war broke out in 1939, his mother and brother were left behind in Łódź and eventually ended up in the Łódź ghetto. And Wendy will be talking about that tomorrow, so I don't want to go into that. But so Szyk felt a very personal connection to this. He felt a very personal connection to the Polish Jewry. And he also, so he has a very, let's say, a strong feeling, a very personal connection to this and the threat of Nazism. And you can see in this picture, this notion of the Nazi global attempted to take over the world. And you see that one of the great things about Szyk is that he includes all these different representations. So you have, for instance, these SS figures as skeletons, and again, drawing on this kind of Judeo-Christian vocabulary of skeletons representing death, often identified with Satan as well. And you have this, and you have the German slogan, that today Europe belongs to us, tomorrow the entire world. And then you've got this kind of interesting way that, again, you have these depictions of snakes, which you're going to see in a lot of Szyk's artwork. And again, this draws on these kind of links to the Bible, links to the representation of the serpent in the Garden of Eden as a representation of Satan and evilness. But I kept thinking about this, and there are various representations of snakes in Szyk's work. You can look at the Haggadah, and you can see various representations there. And of course, what's I think also interesting about Szyk is that he shows a great deal of detail in these, so that, for instance, that you can identify the weapons, the metals, and various other things. But then I thought, well, looking at this snake is very interesting because he shows a rattlesnake, which is a snake found in the United States, which conveys in a kind of subtle way the kind of notion of a fifth column in the Americas that would be aiding the Nazis. And you see this, for those people who know the arsenal of democracy, you see the same representation of the rattlesnake with swastikas on it. And for those of you who are familiar with Szyk's work dealing with the United States, know that, for instance, he took aim at Charles Lindbergh in a variety of different cartoons, some of those published in the American Mercury, and Gerald P. Nye. And he presented them both as would-be Nazi leaders, that is, people who used anti-Semitism, that he linked, Lindbergh's, kind of accused Lindbergh of wanting to be the new, Nazi leader of the United States, and showed in the background a kind of this madman's dream of Hitler on the face of the Statue of Liberty with a swastika instead of the torch of freedom there. And of course, Gerald P. Nye was a senator from Montana who was very active in a variety of different congressional campaigns against the armaments industry. But he was a rabid isolationist like Lindbergh. But he also, at the time that Szyk was doing his cartoons, had attacks on Lindbergh and Nye. Nye was leading a congressional investigation into Hollywood, where he claimed that the Hollywood producers, and of course he emphasized the kind of the Jewish backgrounds of a lot of these Hollywood moguls, was essentially pushing the United States into war. So you have both Lindbergh and Nye promoting the idea in 1941 that it is the Jews, among others, and the Roosevelt administration that is pushing the United States into war in Europe. So Szyk took aim at that. And I thought about this, and I said, it's pretty remarkable. He's in the United States, really only since the beginning of 1941, and he's already getting involved in some of these political controversies and laying out a particular perspective, that is opposed to this isolationism, and the anti-Semitism that some of the people professed. And so it's kind of remarkable for somebody who, had only been in this country a short amount of time to take aim at this. Now, I want to show this because, and you're probably saying, well, there's no Nazis in this picture. And it's true. But it's something that's I think was an important image for Szyk. Those people who have seen Szyk's Haggadah know that this image appears in that very strongly. In fact, Cecil Roth, who was the very prominent British Jewish scholar who did the introduction to Szyk's Haggadah, talked about the importance of the story of Amalek to Szyk. That he said that if you wanted to understand Szyk's Haggadah, it was about that. Now, this story, of course, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, it dates back to the story of, as the Jews were leaving Egypt and crossed the Red Sea and going towards the Promised Land. They were in the desert, and they were, according to the book of Exodus and other biblical texts, they were attacked by Amalek. And it doesn't explain why he does that, but he attacks them. And it goes further. It says he attacked the weakest members of the Jewish community that was struggling to get through this desert. And God, according to the tradition, God urged, Moses to fight against Amalek. And you have this campaign that goes on. Joshua goes out to fight the Amalekites. And Moses stays on top of the hill observing this battle. And according to the biblical story, Moses, when he raised his arm up, the Israelites won. And when his hand went down, Amalek won. And in the story, you have that Moses has become weary from raising his arms up, and that Aaron and Hur place a stone so he can sit on it and use their arms, raise his arms up so that so that there's final victory over Amalek. And it's interesting because the Jewish tradition of Amalek is one that urges both to blot out the memory of Amalek as this enemy of the Jewish people, and yet remember, which is a very interesting thing, and you have a number of representations in Christian art, for instance, in the medieval period. And I wonder, how much Szyk knew of these. I think we know relatively little about what Szyk studied when he was in France. We know that he took an interest in Persian miniatures and miniatures that are found in Christian texts, as well as in illuminated manuscripts. We know he drew on that, but what exact collections he used? Was he using these moralized Bibles? What text was he using? But it became important to him, and actually it's interesting because this story of Moses, Aaron, and Hur, and this battle over Amalek, was also found in medieval Christian artwork. But it took on a very different turn because it came to prefigure the coming of Jesus. That is, this representation of Moses' arms was seen as a kind of a prefiguration of the crucifixion. So it was interpreted that way. Joshua was seen as kind of prefiguring Jesus. So that there were ways in which Christian artists and writers took this same story and kind of transformed it as a kind of leading into the coming of Jesus. But it's interesting, like in Szyk's portrayals of this story, we all know who the Amalek that he's talking about is in the Haggadah, but he doesn't show it. Unlike some of the Christian ones that show the campaign where Moses is on the top of the hill watching it, Szyk doesn't show that. He shows this image of triumph, of final victory. Because this, and I kept thinking to myself, is this the way in which he's blotting out the memory of Amalek and also, retaining this remembrance of this event? Remember in the story, God tells Moses to essentially to inscribe this in a memorial, and Moses creates a memorial to this victory. But then, there's a reference that in every generation, Amalek will return. So this notion of a reoccurring enemy of the Jewish people. And it's interesting, when you read some of the accounts of some Holocaust survivors and others, that they refer to their own experience, that Amalek is the Nazis. Just as Szyk saw in the Haggadah, that he portrayed he wanted to portray them as the ancient Egyptians, and originally painted swastikas on them and on the armbands and various other things, but was forced to remove those by the publishers who feared negative reaction from Nazi Germany over that. But it was something that I think people understood. They could read between the lines. And I think with this triumph of showing Moses, Aaron, and Hur triumph over Jewry's enemies is one that I think Szyk used to kind of inspire, to create optimism, not for people to be, that was notion that we will be victorious. And I think it's this kind of encouragement of this story that I think becomes important to him, is that there'll be this kind of eventual triumph. And here we see that he's portrayed this kind of this image in very World War II forms. And so you have the kind of representation of the Jewish fighter and the Jewish worker, the home front and the military front among Jews combining in this eventual victory over Nazism, over the Amalek of their own time. And so this is one where Szyk drew on much of this Jewish tradition as education, but as also optimism, to promote also a heroic notion of the Jewish past, which is, I think, something that Szyk was instrumental in. That is, to show that Jewish history had its heroes, its great figures, And he wanted that to convey that both to the Jewish people, but I think also to the outside world, that this was that Jews had a heroic history, and I think he was, quite adamant about doing that, and I think quite successful actually in conveying that in his artwork. Now I want to bring up kind of another kind of figure that's somewhat linked in this story, although from a very different perspective, and that's the Antichrist. And going through this, I kept saying, well, what do we, is this something that Szyk drew upon in his own work? And what's interesting about the comparison with Amalek and the Antichrist is that they're both seen as enemies, but humans. They're not Satan, but they are humans that can be defeated. And the Antichrist, of course, Szyk did a painting in 1942 called The Antichrist, and which shows an image of Adolf Hitler looking straight at the audience, and you see in his eyes skulls representing death, and in his hair, in the Latin, is woe to the vanquished, and behind him is enslavement and fire, and fire and destruction. But he's also portrayed in that image like representations of Jesus in medieval work, which is often a frontal position, not a profile. And it also works for propaganda reasons, in that it's kind of a direct appeal to your audience. So, but I kept thinking, well, I think that Szyk is digging deeper into this and getting across this notion of using this kind of legend of the Antichrist to pillory and attack the Nazis. And again, I found this an interesting case because when you look back at the earliest legends of the Antichrist was portrayed as coming from the Jewish tribe of Dan, was said to have been circumcised in Jerusalem, was seen as being the spawn of the devil and a Jewish prostitute, according to many of these traditions. And even you had and then, of course, and this was common in the medieval period and the early modern period, this kind of image. But here I think we see another one of those examples of where Szyk is kind of transforming this legend to make Hitler and the Nazis the representative of this ultimate evil. And it's interesting to note that for those people who are familiar with the protocols of the Elders of Zion, that one of the key promoters of that, Sergei Nilis, much of what he wrote on top of that, the protocols, was dealing with the coming of the Antichrist, that the Jews, this would be the Jewish Messiah. And so I think Szyk is drawing on this legend, but again, transforming this. So making the Nazis, and Adolf Hitler in particular, representative of the Antichrist. And if you see in this, there's certain elements in this that I think link to that story. You have, for instance, Hitler sitting on this throne, if one will, and it says in German, I am the Holy Ghost, or I'm the Holy Spirit. And again, comes from New Testament, interpretations of that. But the notion and the notion of these world leaders surrounding the Antichrist in support of his global campaign. And the notion of that this Antichrist kind of mimics Jesus and in certain ways, and so you also have in this particular case this image of the Jew that a representation of a Jew that is, and it says the subhuman, perish, or perish the subhuman. But then you have these two figures of representing John Bull and Uncle Sam. And I thought, well, this also has a link to the Antichrist legend. Of course, for those people who are familiar with it, in some of the legend, there's the notion of two witnesses who are brought before the Antichrist. And often they're depicted as being either Elijah and Enoch, or Moses, sometimes and Elijah, or sometimes not identified. But the notion is that they were two prophets who spoke out against the Antichrist, and so that the Antichrist puts them to death. And of course, this is the story, the image here, the title that Szyk gives it is A Madman's Dream. That is, this is Hitler's vision of the future, of destroying the Jews in Europe. And Szyk was Szyk understood right away, I was, at least by 1939, that Nazi anti-Semitism was very different than many other forms of anti-Semitism. And he referred to it as being exterminatory. That is, the idea was for the Nazis to eliminate all of Jews. And so you have this kind of representation of that in Hitler's dream, that you're going to have the eradication of the Jewish people, world conquest, again, like the Antichrist has, the image of these two witnesses paraded around before they're to be executed. And you also have, in some cases, I notice that sometimes you see this kind of satanic trinity that's represented in some of Szyk's artwork of the Axis powers, that often there are three figures that are larger than the other ones. And I think that and Szyk often uses this idea of a hierarchy even among Nazi leaders, so that you've got, often the Pierre Lavals and the Pétains, they're presented as much smaller. Often sometimes Mussolini's up there, sometimes he's portrayed as a kind of a ragged, fool. But you have this, but I think this conveys some of that notion, drawing on this history. And I don't think it necessarily did everybody get that. Did people understand that? But I think Szyk is pulling on those kind of legends to get those across. And I think likewise in this image too, that we see this Schicklgruber the first, always playing on, Hitler's father's real name. And the notion that Hitler is this new leader of the conquered, Russia, but this kind of would-be imperial leader who is, carries the symbols of his, of his authority. And I think, when you think about like even the representations of that Szyk uses to link it to the Antichrist thing, there's always the notion of that instead of the cross, you have the Hakenkreuz, the swastika, what in translated in German is a crooked cross. So that's the symbol of this Antichrist. Mein Kampf is often presented in Szyk's work as kind of the anti-Bible, if one will. That is something that promotes hatred, instead of love and goodness. So and also another element of this story of the Antichrist was the notion of the Antichrist being a false prophet. Now, what's interesting, and this I don't know how much Szyk was aware of this. I think he was aware of this in some respects, but Hitler constantly referred to himself as being a prophet. And this goes back to the 1920s, where he talks about making a prophecy, and that he's and probably his most famous example of that was in January 30th, 1939, where in front of the Reichstag, and this was filmed, and it was promoted by the Nazis. He announced, in a prophecy. He says, I will once more be a prophet and say, if international Jewry inside and outside of international finance Jewry inside and outside of Europe succeeds in plunging the world back into war again, it will not be the Bolshevization of the earth but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe that will occur. Now, and that's something that Szyk, I think, was aware of. In one of his pieces that he did from 1942, I think references that, showing Hitler in front of, at the Sportpalast in Berlin, and a skull with a Jewish skull on the ground with a bullet hole in it. And referencing the mass murder of the Jews. And it was at the same time that Hitler referred once again to his prophecy speech. He did that about 5 times during the war, referring back to that speech. He said, I said this, the Jews laughed at me when I said that, made that prophecy. And he said, they're not laughing now, so that he was conveying, this idea. And I think Szyk was, picked up on that, in that particular piece. But I think whether Szyk knew about, Hitler's long claims of using this notion of being a prophet, I think it certainly fits into this notion that he represents, at least in this kind of false prophet, this kind of representation of the Antichrist. And by this I don't mean that Szyk actually believed in a religious or theological sense in this, but I think he saw this as a part of the Western vocabulary that people would understand the threat that Nazism represented, not just to Jews, but to Christians and everyone else. Now, I want to actually show another piece of artwork that is not by Arthur Szyk, but it does link to this notion. And this is a piece that was done by a Nazi artist called by the name of Hermann Otto Heuer. Now, I don't know if anybody knows what this is called, but the title of this was "In the Beginning Was the Word." And again, this was done 1936, 1937. And of course, that comes from the New Testament book of John. But instead of having, and it refers to Jesus, but you have Hitler portrayed as a kind of a messianic figure here. And it follows kind of that biblical linkage that the light emanates off Adolf Hitler's face, illuminating the rest of the audience. That here is this new kind of a Messiah, if one will. And Heuer was trying to represent the appeal that Adolf Hitler had to the German people. And this is kind of represents a microcosm of German society. So women, men, people of different classes. And you see that, and so it conveys this notion both that Hitler's words are appealing to them, but that the audience finds something appealing in Adolf Hitler. And it also plays up something that Hitler talked about, the importance of the spoken word. Hitler believed that the spoken word was responsible for all the great events in history. including Christianity, that it was a spoken word that motivated people. And of course, he was an orator that was very gifted in conveying his message, however repugnant that was. But he saw this. Interesting enough, Leon Trotsky, who we were brought up earlier in a conversation, Trotsky said that the reason Hitler said that is because he couldn't write. And but the idea, I think, that this painting conveys, and this was a painting that Hitler owned, and this was put on display. They made posters of this, they made postcards of it. So it was widely representative and known to many people in Europe in the 1930s. And again, this kind of, I think it builds on this, and again, this is where we don't know enough about where Szyk is drawing his ideas from. He clearly draws from a variety of sources. And I sometimes wonder, I remember talking to his daughter. She said, he had this big library of stuff, And I said, and sometimes in Cartoon Crusader, this newsreel that was done about it, you see some of those books on the shelves, and you kind of wonder, what happened to those? What was he reading? What was he drawing on, in thinking about some of these images? And I think that, this idea of linking, using this kind of biblical language and vocabulary comes out very clearly in the next piece that I'm going to show you, which I think is the final piece that we're going to look at. And I bring this up because this is from the book of Revelation again, which is lays the groundwork for the notion of an antichrist. And it says, this is, sorry to bring this up in a Jesuit school, but this is the King James, I think, translation of this. And it says, I looked, and behold, a pale horse, and his name that sat upon him was Death, and hell followed with him. And power was given unto them over the fourth part of the earth, to kill with the sword, and with hunger, and with the beasts of the earth. Now, I don't know if you can see this very well. It's very intricately detailed. There are a number of these images that Szyk did that I think are quite remarkable, and he did this kind of in the style of Albrecht Dürer, who also did these kind of images of the four horsemen of the apocalypse and things, of this biblical linking to the Bible. And here you have this kind of representation of Hitler as that figure on the pale horse, that is, he represents death. And you see this kind of figure of Satan there, holding the swastika. And you see all this kind of hell unleashed, and death and destruction everywhere. And you see the figure of, both a Christian and a Jew and a murdered baby there. And I was trying to read at the bottom of that, in the Latin, where the Jewish the murdered Jewish man is holding that, and it reminded me that in that biblical tradition, both in Judaism and in Christianity, is the notion that the righteous will be inscribed in the book of life, and that there's a book of death and others. And of course, we some of us celebrate Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, so this is kind of fresh in the mind. But this notion that I kept thinking, well, here's does it represent in this particular case that you have the representations of the man holding the cross, the symbol of his love for Christianity, and the Jewish figure holding onto this book, whether that's this being inscribed in the book of life, whether that represents the love for the Torah and and the Bible. But you see again these kind of representations of evil, and you have sorry, I'm looking at a very small screen here, but you have both the notion of the skeleton holding this crown, over the top. Again, this kind of notion of the Antichrist being this kind of ruler over this empire in opposition to Christianity, and you also, I believe there is someone holding a copy of Mein Kampf, one of those demons in the back. And again, that kind of, there's so many intricate details in these. And of course, you have often the figure of death on the pale rider was often shown with a sword. You see that sword in the scabbard is represented there. But interestingly enough, in this particular case, I was looking at, often this is described as, Walpurgisnacht, even at the museum. I think we have this image in our collection, which also represents the kind of, in German folklore, this period when witches hold their coven and try to, resurrect evils. But you also have the counter example of, Saint Walpurga, who fought against witchcraft, and you have these bonfires that are aimed to prevent, evil from overtaking it. But I ran across a reference in the Art Digest that refers to this work and calls it the forces of evil, which I think in some ways might be more fitting. But that was, that's to be determined. But I think what's remarkable about Szyk's artwork is the kind of ways in which you can dig so much deeper for new meaning. That is, in this particular case or in many of his others. But I think just to conclude on this, that I think one of the remarkable things about Szyk is that, in a relatively short amount of time, he put out a lot of artwork that challenged his audiences to change their behavior, to change their perspectives, to attack anti-Semitism, to attack Nazism, to attack Nazism in the States, to attack racism in his adopted country. And again, that's, you think about that as he's an immigrant that comes to this country, but he sees that as a problem that needs to be solved. He says, well, what are you going to do when the war's over? And he talks about that he wants to work for the enfranchisement of blacks in the United States. That he takes this very personally, that these become part of his kind of crusades, whether that's, and again, a crusade afterwards for the state of Israel. That these become his kind of personal quests, his personal crusades. But I think, and I think in that sense, Szyk represents a very good model of someone who takes his artwork to promote causes that are, I think, for the benefit of humankind. That is to combat racism, to combat hatred, to combat these forces of evil, and to try to create a better future. So I want to just leave off there, and thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the symposium.